This is a retired lieutenant colonel in the United States Army who served 21 years on active duty and reserve duty. He taught history at Northwestern MI College in Traverse City, specializing in military history with courses on the American Civil War, the First and Second World Wars, and Vietnam War. After teaching college history for 27 years, he retired and moved to the Villages in 2016. Today, he will speak on the role of women in the Vietnam War.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. I've been teaching Vietnam history since the 1990s, and one of the things I always wanted to do was have Vietnam veterans come into my classroom, which I was very lucky to do, and had a whole gamut from POWs to dog handlers, and one of the most powerful we ever had in the room were nurses. And I was very lucky to have some nurses that would come in that had served in Vietnam. So we're going to briefly talk about the role of women in the Vietnam, and we're going to focus on women. Now, the Vietnam War, when did it start? Most historians will say 64 to 75. The first American that was killed in Vietnam was killed in September of 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey with the OSS, which is today the CIA, was accidentally killed by Viet Minh guerrillas who mistook him for a French officer. So the war, in many cases, went on much longer than we might think. Here you can see an advertisement for officer, nurse, and woman, as the Army's wanted nurses in Vietnam. And I also want to highlight the role of African-American nurses and African-American women in the Vietnam War. They made up about 5% of the women that were overseas. And African-American women really began to play a significant role in World War II. This is the 6th 888th. As you can see, it's a postal battalion. It was the only African-American WAC unit to go overseas in World War II. They just received a Congressional Gold Medal. They processed 7 million pieces of back mail to increase GI morale in the European theater. And so it's an amazing story of what these young women went through. In the Korean War, there were African-American nurses and about 540 Army nurses that served in the embattled peninsula of Korea. And we know this one very well because we've all seen the TV series MASH, which came from the movie, which was supposed to be originally about the Vietnam War. They thought it might be a little too controversial. We've got about 11,000 women that served in Vietnam in either the United States Army, the Navy, or the U.S. Air Force. There's a question mark there because different sources will give us different numbers ranging from about 10 to 13,000. Most of the sources focus on about 11,000. 9% of them were nurses, but about 1,300 were part of the Women's Army Corps. And then we had somewhere around 10,000 civilian women that also served their duty stations in Vietnam. So that's a very interesting story in itself. Now, one of the things you might not know is 2/3 of the men that served in World War II were drafted. 2/3 of the men who served in Vietnam were volunteers, and only 26% were drafted. The nation tends to have that flipped around, but that's the case. But all the military women who were in Vietnam were volunteers. And the first nurses arrived in 1956. See that date of 64 there again? It all depends on the sources that you use. Why did you join? It's not for me to decide as to the righteousness or the wrongness of the war. My decision was that I was the best possible care I could give them. There's Captain Elizabeth Allen when she served in Vietnam, and here she is in 2007 talking about her experiences. So they came for many different reasons, but this is just one nurse's role, a reason of why she went to Vietnam. Some 27,250 Black or African-American women were in the Vietnam era. That means they didn't all serve in Vietnam. There were a lot of women on duty in what they called the era that never made it in country during that period of time. But here we can see another African-American Army nurse, Captain Joyce Johnson, and there she is helping one of her patients. So they all played very key and critical roles. We don't want to forget about the United States Navy. It had 2 hospital ships serving off the coast of Vietnam. So they would deal mostly with Marine Corps and Navy wounded in actions. This ship here, the USS Repose, was known as the Angel of the Orient. She treated some 9,000 casualties and 24,000 patients, which means she also treated Vietnamese civilians. And then we had also the USS Sanctuary that served just off the coast. In addition, the United States Air Force had flight nurses in Vietnam. Generally, when patients were very seriously wounded, they needed to be treated and then moved on. This is the C-9A Sea Nightingale, which the pilots who flew it called it the Cadillac of the medevacs. And you can see, hopefully down in the lower right corner, flight nurses tending wounded on their way to different hospitals outside of the theater. Now, the most emotionally hazardous duty of the war was being a nurse. And I've had more than one nurse tell me that. And I'm going to talk about one of the nurses that used to come to my class. And when she came, she brought an ammo box. And there's a picture of an ammo box down there in the lower right corner. And then she'd sit up in front of my students and she'd open up that ammo box. And by that period of time, she had told them about things about how it changed her life, how she had endured shelling and rockets, how she was a triage nurse, which decided which patients would make their way into the operating rooms as they came off the medevac choppers. Very demanding, very stressful position when you have all these wounded men's lives in your hands. And then she'd begin to pull things out of that box one at a time, and she'd hold them up. And there were a whole variety of things, from pictures of individual soldiers, crosses, dog tags, lighters, and it went on and on. And every time she pulled one of those items out, it had blood on it. And what happened is, as she was working on those young soldiers and deciding who went and who waited, in many cases they wanted to give her something so that she would remember them when they came out of their operation and they could talk and chat. And many of those men didn't come out of their operations. And she kept all those mementos, and she pulled them out of that box one at a time, and she could describe those men, and she knew most of their names, and my students would start crying, and then she'd start crying, and then she was so powerful in bringing that facet of the Vietnam War to life for those students, many of which hadn't been born when the Vietnam War was going on. So it's an amazing story. It's one of the most powerful I've ever experienced in my courses, and I've had a lot of Vietnam veterans come to my courses with some very powerful stories. But I would have to agree that it was truly a very powerful teaching tool. Now, as I said, not all of them were nurses. Here's this is Esther Gleaton. She's a Spec 4 clerk typist in a WAC detachment, 68, 69, doing her role. And one of the interesting things, when they began to send the Army Women Corps to Vietnam in 1963, they had no male overseas uniforms. They had no jungle uniforms. So these WACs are in male uniforms before the Army could catch up with its decision to send them overseas. In addition, you're going to work with the South Vietnamese WAC Corps. And here we see one of the first U.S. Army WACs getting off the plane and greeting her counterpart in the South Vietnamese Women's Army Corps as they would serve together across Vietnam. In addition, as I said, about 10,000, although that number is very hard to pull down, worked for the Red Cross, the USO, the different airlines, the Peace Corps, Catholic Relief Services. We could go on and on and on. And as you add it up over the years, there's 10,000, and then they left and another came. We believe about 50,000 in total were there during the course of the war. 59 of those civilian women were killed in Vietnam. So some of them paid the ultimate price. Here's an example. This is an individual who worked for the Red Cross, and she was assigned to be a clubmobile recreational worker. You can see her there on the right, standing in her Red Cross uniform. You might be able to catch the boots and shoes, or the boots she has on. And then we can see some Red Cross women there working with military hospital patients in the different in-theater hospitals. In addition, Armed Forces Radio and TV in Vietnam had women. We can see there's a woman DJ, and there's the weather girl, who was the most popular woman in Vietnam, as you can well imagine. Bobby there has a very interesting story, and she became very popular. Now, this is the Vietnam War, or the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, generally called the Wall. We want to talk about the women whose names are on the wall. And 8 were killed, 7 by accidents and or disease, and 1 by hostile fire. And all of their names are on the wall. That Veterans memorial you see there, we'll talk about that just briefly. And these are the 8 women who were killed in Vietnam, and it's First Lieutenant Sharon Ann Lane. There's her picture. She was killed by hostile fire as they rocketed the hostile area on her base. Okay. And this is the Vietnam Memorial, and I want to highlight the architect or the designer of the Vietnam Memorial, who was also a woman, Mei Ling there, and it was very controversial to design at first. In fact, so controversial that in order to gain more support, they decided to put up a male statue, a series of males in a statue, and then the women said, well, wait a minute, now what about our role? What about our contributions? And it took the Army nurses about 10 years to finally get their memorial, which is also there at the Vietnam Memorial, or the wall. And there's Ms. Carlson, who was the founder and led the project, which finally got the money raised, the congressional approval, and the Women's Memorial built. This is a quote from her. Some said women had not been in combat, did not suffer, and were too few in number to be honored. And that really upset her, as you can well imagine. And they were able to achieve their goal. So I think this is a great picture. You can see the reflection of the women against the wall. That's one of the more powerful things about that wall. There are 2 presses on that wall, and it's very powerful to go there and to see the reflection of the family as you look at the wall and then see that reflection. So it's an amazing picture. Now, in addition, this is the search for MIAs. As of the last figure I had in 2021, the Defense POW MIA agency says there's 82,000 service members still missing in action. They come from the Second World War all the way up to the current period, with about 72,000 of them from World War I. One was just recently recovered, so that process is always ongoing. About 42,000 of the World War II MIAs are from the United States Army and the United States Army Air Force. 7,500 from Korea, where it's very difficult to get them back, or the North Koreans generally don't cooperate here eventually, or lately. About 1,500, although that number you'll see at different places and different times. We just had one of them recovered and returned, and that process is ongoing. 3 from Iraqi freedom. And of the 82,000, the defense agency says about 38,000 are simply unrecoverable due to a whole variety of issues. Now, and then we have Dr. Elena Vette, the only American woman who remains unaccounted for from the Vietnam War. She disappeared in 1962, became America's first female POW. She was taken by the Viet Cong with 2 of her male comrades and was never heard of again. We believe she was eventually assassinated by the Viet Cong, and she was a doctor/missionary. And she was removed with 2 of her other fellow missionaries from that facility. The category is deferred, so they are no longer looking for, or do they have a find her. So I want to thank this organization for your support of veterans. I hope you enjoyed our short presentation about women in the Vietnam War. It's an untold story, a little known story, but a very important one. So thank you very much.